Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar. It's the fourth webinar in our Developing Broadband Leadership series entitled Funding and Partnerships. Our co-hosts during this whole series is the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society and the Illinois Office of Broadband. And we welcome Bill Coleman, who works with communities in Illinois and the Benton Institute to provide assistance in planning for broadband adoption, use, access, and equity. And we'll be giving remarks today before welcoming our main presenter. Before turning it over to Bill, I just wanted to encourage everyone to utilize the chat space to ask questions at any time during the presentation and during the discussions. And Bill will be facilitating a question and answer later during the program today. I'll also be sending up a follow-up email with all of the materials for today, as well as a recording. And if you did not register for this session or this series, you can direct message me your email if you are not sure and you want to be sure that you can receive materials for that. All right, so I just want to say thank you again, and I'll hand it over to you now, Bill.
Thank you, Nancy, very much. Welcome everyone, and thanks to our speakers who are going to join us today. We have Matt Schmidt from the Illinois Office of Broadband, who's going to lead off with a little bit about the funding available, the funding opportunity right now through the Illinois Office of Broadband, and how that can be combined with some of the resources that Joanne will talk about soon. Joanne Hovis is a leading technology, community technology expert, and she's reporting from the big Fiber Broadband Association conference in Nashville today. So we appreciate her willingness to double dip on events today. So we'll get to Joanne in just a few minutes. But what makes for a good broadband partner? My mother always used to tell me to pick my friends, don't let them pick me, and that's worked out pretty good over quite a lifetime of friendships and partnerships and so on. So I think that's really an important thing for communities to think about. It's really a community that should decide the quality of broadband that's going to be available in your community. And so to get that quality that you want, you need to find the right partner. And that partnership is an arrangement where parties agree to cooperate to advance their mutual interests. And I think that's really important as we go through today's seminar to think about what are your own community's goals, your vision for broadband, and how do you get an arrangement that for the long term will satisfy your community goals. Private partners that you're seeking need to be trusted. And so one of the things that I think is really important is when you think about an infrastructure partnership, that's really a long-term arrangement. And as many of you might have heard me already say by now, that this is not a prom date, this is a marriage. And so you want to make sure that you can really trust that partner to be there for the long term. You want to listen to local voices that are setting out the community goals and be responsive to that, whether that's on the strict network side, but also things like economic development and digital equity, social justice, and so on. So that's really important that provider is sitting at the table in the community. That your provider is financially transparent and ready to share the risk and the success of this venture. And so those are critical things that as you think about trying to decide what are real costs that can be allocated to the construction or operations and maintenance, that those things are clear to the community and that the community does its due diligence on all those things. Having a local presence is really critical, and sharing that long-term community perspective is absolutely necessary for that successful long-term partnership. That's the extent of my local remarks, and now I'm going to bring on Matt Schmidt, and Matt is the director of the Office of Broadband, and Illinois is lucky to have so many resources available for community broadband networks. It'll be great to hear what Matt has to say. Matt, welcome.
Well, thanks a lot, Bill. And talking about resources, we're lucky to have you as part of the conversation on broadband in Illinois. And thank you for today and for this great webinar series. And again, thanks to University Extension and Nancy and your team for making this so smooth for all of us. And so we're talking about broadband funding. I think if there's a theme in 2021, it's the broadband moment is upon us. If I have a theme for the last several months, we want to seize this moment. We want to take full advantage of the funding opportunities that are out there. So for the last couple of years, Illinois has led the way with its Connect Illinois investments, $420 million for broadband infrastructure. And we're really pleased with the way the program is going so far. We look forward to making some announcements in the coming weeks regarding round 2 of our Connect Illinois grant program. So local communities or providers or cooperatives or partnerships of other kinds that have come to the state that have wanted to partner with us, we're eager to partner with you. And so we look forward to making that announcement in the coming weeks on our round 2 cohort. We'll also be announcing our round 3 NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunity, for those same Connect Illinois dollars moving forward. And so if you're a provider or a local community, you're interested in partnering with the state on infrastructure, keep an eye out for more news on the Connect Illinois front. Just as a teaser, if you will, we expect this round of funding to be significantly larger than the previous 2. We also will be relaxing our non-state match requirements a little bit, and understanding that the cost of doing business with the state is not zero, and also that there are some areas that are really hard to serve in Illinois, and the business case is difficult as a result. And so we want to put the resources into a partnership with our providers, with our communities, to get the job done right once and for all. And also, we look forward to accepting applications, making awards on a rolling basis moving forward. And we think, just given all the investment in broadband and the critical need that we see across the state, it's important for us to be nimble and to deploy these resources and get these projects going as quick as we can. And so this is just, advice for those who might be interested. Now is the perfect time to be looking at the maps, looking at your community, forging those partnerships, and looking at our past notice of funding opportunities, and starting to draft some material for us. So stay tuned for announcements on Connect Illinois round 2 cohort, and also our round 3 notice of funding opportunity. And so beyond the investment that Governor Pritzker and our General Assembly has made, nation-leading broadband matching grants in Illinois, we also have a tremendous opportunity with the federal funding that's available. And so details are still coming down the pike in terms of what those programs look like and how we might take advantage of them. But I would just emphasize, if you're a local community and you know that you want to do something on broadband, but you just don't know how, or you don't know if this is the right time, let me tell you, now is the perfect time to be having these conversations, to be engaging this kind of dialogue with this webinar series, and also be seeking out, I think, answers or opportunities for next steps. And so the Office of Broadband is here to help you, I think, take full stock of those opportunities that are out there. Just a couple that I just wanted to flag. One, included in the ARPA bill, the American Rescue Plan Act, billions of dollars for state and local fiscal recovery. And basically, these are dollars that can be used for broadband specifically, without a local community having to apply for a grant or go out and seek the dollars competitively. They're there for you to apply for broadband. And so as I hear from counties and communities and other units of government across the state that want to partner and lean in on this opportunity, that's a great place to start. Those dollars are there for you to apply to broadband builds. Secondly, we also have some funding dedicated to non-entitlement units. So whether you're townships or other smaller units of government that might not have a direct appropriation, there is an opportunity through the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity to enter into a portal. I'll post that link online here, and for you to secure some of those funds that can be used for broadband. Just a couple examples of those programs that are out there that are unique, that aren't with us every year. And so when we talk about seizing the broadband moment, those are the sorts of programs that might not be with us in the years to come. So learn about them, reach out to us at the Office of Broadband, broadband@illinois.gov if you'd like to get some more information. and we'd be happy to help you take next steps and think through things. As I look ahead in my schedule every week, I have touch points with whether it's governments or local units of government in counties, cities, talking about these funding opportunities and ways in which they can take next steps together, oftentimes with the providers in their area to build out broadband. And so I'm always happy to do that. Again, broadband@illinois.gov is the best way to reach us. Otherwise, if you throw your contact information in the chat here, I'll try to get back to you right away here today too. And so those are just a few opportunities that we have. Outside of that, if you're a provider, I think we look at the programs that we have with USDA Reconnect, or FCC has some great funding promoting broadband expansion for libraries or schools. Likewise, we have some great pilot programs for connecting minority communities that we're paying close attention to, or for advancing telehealth or remote learning. We want to take full advantage of those. And so the Office of Broadband is here to help. If you have any questions, again, we want to start that dialogue with you. And I think the way for Illinois to succeed on this front is to have an all hands on deck approach, where it's not a state-driven approach from the Office of Broadband, but rather we'd be a facilitator. We help empower our local communities and our providers across the state to form partnerships to take advantage of these opportunities. And so that's the mentality that we have. And so we really hope to hear from you. We'll continue to try to invest in programming like this and allow for those that are interested in learning more to learn a little bit more, so you can lean into this opportunity. But if I could just emphasize, this moment likely will not repeat itself. And so if you're on a local board or a planning council, or you're a champion in your own right at the local level, and you'd like to see a different broadband future for your community or for your family or for your business, now is the time to lean into that. And so we've got some state-specific funding on the infrastructure front. We've got our Connect Illinois program. We're also developing an increasingly robust digital equity package. And so, if you're tuning into this, you're probably familiar with our Illinois Connected Communities program. We also have some work in digital navigators and regional collaboration that we're looking forward to announcing in the coming weeks and months. And so there's an increasingly robust package of broadband programming that hopefully will serve your community. And outside of that, no shortage of federal opportunities, details still coming available to us now. And so with that said, I look forward to starting some conversations, engaging in dialogue here today. And again, I thank you for your interest in broadband. And again, it's an all hands on deck approach here in Illinois that's going to help us seize this opportunity. So thanks, Bill. Thanks, Nancy. Joanne, can't wait to hear from you.
Thank you, Matt. And welcome, Joanne. Joanne is president of CTC Technology and Energy, and they're a national consulting firm, and they've worked with literally hundreds of communities and organizations around the country to improve broadband services, creating projects that work for communities that provide a foundation for additional broadband investment and services. And I think CTC is seen as a national leader in adopting new strategies, innovative strategies that bring powerful results. So welcome, Joanne. Joanne, do you want me to share my screen, or are you going to do that from Nashville?
I'll share mine if that's okay.
That's perfect.
I will we'll give it a try and see if I can get the technology to work using hotel Wi-Fi. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you. And let me just say, Nancy, Bill, Matt, thank you. I'm really honored to have this opportunity. Bill, let me know when you see my my deck.
Looks like it's starting up right now.
Excellent. Okay, we'll just enlarge it, and there we are. Okay, well, I will, starting with just a couple of preliminary thoughts I'd like to share with you all, which are that you are very fortunate in the state of Illinois to have the leadership that you do, as reflected on today's call. And I can tell you, because I work in probably 2/3 of the states, and I work for many of the states in their broadband planning, but Illinois is in a singular position in terms of the leadership your elected leadership has shown, and the funding that was brought to the table long before the federal government figured out just how much it needed to do, and the folks who are guiding you on a day-to-day basis and developing the programs from which all your communities will benefit. And I am a former Illinoisan. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. My extended family, my whole family is still there. And I consider you a very fortunate state. Happy to be associated with this effort this morning. I have the pleasure of talking to you this morning about partnerships, particularly I think public-private partnerships, but we don't want to limit it to that. There are many places where partnerships are developing among public entities, so public-public, and in some places also private-private, particularly in the case, for example, where electric cooperatives are working with commercial ISPs on partnership strategies. But for the most part, we'll be talking about public-private partnerships, and I'm going to be sharing some insights as to how these kinds of initiatives are emerging around the country and how they are both making use of and creating new opportunity for existing funding, broadband funding and partnerships. What's the secret there? And while I can't offer a specific formula of do X, Y, and Z, and that will therefore untap A, B, and C resources, and I wish I could offer you that formula, I think what I can share today is some insights about what we see emerging, how those of you who are local communities can think about working with private partners. Those of you who are private ISPs can think about reaching out to your potential public partners who are going to be a magic ingredient in allowing you to scale and develop new networks, and what all of this means from the standpoint of funding, both with respect to how you're using existing funding that your communities already have access to, such as the fiscal recovery funds that Matt just referenced, and with respect to how these kinds of partnerships will enable development of new ways of doing things and strategies that are optimized, hopefully, for enabling you to compete for both federal and state dollars. I am in the embarrassing spot right now where housekeeping is knocking at my door. I will be right back.
And I'll just pause the recording.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for your patience with me. This is the peril of working out of a hotel room, which is an unfamiliar experience of the past 18 months, but I seem to have dived right back into. And unfortunately, the do not disturb sign didn't work. So thank you very much for your patience. I appreciate it. I hope everybody had a good stretch, however brief that was. So let's dive right back in and get into some substance. What I'm going to share with you today is kind of some basic preliminary information about why to consider this and why I think that partnerships create opportunity for communities who wouldn't otherwise be able to engage in the broadband marketplace, or perhaps not at the level that they would like to, who have traditionally been shut out of it. I'm going to share why I think these kinds of collaborations between public and private are attracting a whole lot of new private players who wouldn't have been involved or interested in the past. And I'll give you a couple or a few examples and case studies from other states that may be of interest as you think about the needs of your community in the state of Illinois. And then I think most consequentially, and I'll spend most time on, what do the partnerships really look like? What are the business models and the scopes and the strategies that are actually emerging? And how does all this relate to your funding strategy? How does it relate to your ability to access grant funds, federal and state, and potentially work with your private partner to address the broadband needs in your community? And that, I think, these last two pieces are the heart of the discussion. I'm also going to invite Bill to interrupt me anytime, particularly if he wants to hurry me along, so that I have guidance if I'm going on at too much length, which I have a tendency to do. So let's start with why you would think about doing this. One way to think of what a partnership allows you to do in a community, whether you're rural, suburban, or urban, is it allows you to divest yourself of the options you've had in the past, which were very limited. You had a binary of options. One was build it and operate it yourself in what is sometimes called municipal broadband or variations on that. Or it was just wait for the private sector to do what you know needs to be done, but the private sector wasn't doing because the investment proposition simply wasn't attractive enough. And private dollars will flow to the places where the investment proposition is most attractive. Private dollars will go to where the return on investment is greatest. Communities can't always change that, but a partnership strategy, in the same way that an economic development strategy changes and shifts the way private entities invest in a community, a partnership strategy can do that in broadband, right? The way economic development would do so in other sectors or other fields of our economy. So what you can do through partnership is change the way private entities invest and try to use your assets, your capabilities, including potentially your own funds, such as the fiscal recovery funds, or your potential ability to bring grant money to the table. You can use that to change the way private investors invest and attract them to parts of your community they wouldn't otherwise go. And to maximize the benefit of private capabilities, because many communities would actually rather not be in the ISP or the service provision business or the internet business. Many would like to be, in which case that is absolutely should be an option for them. But this gives many communities a wider range of options. I think critically as well, when one thinks about a collaboration strategy or a partnership between two or more entities, the way we tend to think about it is, how do we efficiently allocate responsibilities and risks among those entities? So for example, a city in which I have worked in recent years in Maryland has a long history and considerable confidence in its ability to build infrastructure. It is, however, not confident or particularly interested in delivering services or managing customer service. It is well positioned to build a partnership in which it takes on the pieces about which it feels very confident and experienced, that is construction of a network, and find a partner with the capabilities to do exactly that with regard to service provision, customer service, and so on. A partner that has the skill and the experience to take on not just those responsibilities, but also the risks that are associated with those responsibilities, generally performance and market risk, the elements of actually having to sell and deliver services in a market, which may or may not be competitive, and to be able to make that business work. Similarly, an example of this kind of distribution, this kind of thoughtful, calculated distribution of responsibility and risk to maximize efficiency might apply in a partnership between an electric utility and another entity. An electric utility, whether public, cooperative, or investor-owned, is going to have considerable capabilities around construction, but also own utility poles and have capabilities around placing infrastructure on utility poles and maintain it. It is really efficient for that entity to do that with regard to those utility poles, rather than requiring another entity that might not have that experience to do exactly the same thing. So just a few examples to give you a framework of how we think about when you build a partnership. You think about the full totality of the things that need to be done to build and operate and maintain a communications network, as well as to finance or fund that communications network, and think about which is the entity that is best suited to do best at that, to do it most cost effectively, to do it most expeditiously, and with the best capabilities to minimize risk to everyone and to maximize benefit to everyone. That results in a win-win. That's a partnership. I'm not using the term partnership here in a very formal legal sense, although it will inevitably require certain kinds of contractual documents between the entities. But I'm using the term partnership to mean a structured and thoughtful collaboration among multiple entities, at a minimum 2, that get to better outcomes in the aggregate and for each individual partner because of the effort to share the various elements of responsibility, risk, and effort. And you'll see in a moment some examples of what that looks like. I think this is something that communities should think about, in part because it gives them a broader range of options, and in part because I think it also opens doors for urban and suburban communities that have traditionally been largely shut out of public funding for broadband, which has gone exclusively to unserved rural areas. A partnership will allow those urban and suburban communities to engage in different kinds of ways than their options would have enabled in the past. Frankly, in some cases, partnerships may also be more politically tenable than the alternatives, in that there is still considerable opposition to public involvement in the broadband space in some states, much less so in Illinois than in others. I'm happy to say considerably less in Illinois. But some pushback from private companies who would rather public entities stay out of this space. Harder to make that case when the effort is to build partnerships. But frankly, there are also members of the community in almost any community I've ever worked in, who are asking their local governments to engage, demanding that their local governments engage, and asking their elected officials to do exactly that, solve our broadband problems. This is a way for those elected officials and their staffs to explore creative options that don't entail some of the considerable risks of a fully municipal or county effort that requires the municipality or the county to do everything, which many communities have done very, very ably, but many communities would rather not undertake themselves. Finally, partnerships allow you to use the sharing of risk, the sharing of opportunity, the sharing of benefit, and your assets, including your dollar resources, to change the way the private sector invests, to attract those private dollars to your community in the same way you would with any other economic development effort, but to do so in a very creative way here in the broadband space, maximizing based on your best capabilities as well as the dollars you have. And what's interesting, I think, in the current moment, and part of the reason why I think we are going to see a lot of grants made to public-private partnerships, and indeed, there is an existing NTIA, Department of Commerce grant program called the Broadband Infrastructure Program, or BIP. That is a grant program that is open until August 17th, that is specifically targeted only for public-private partnerships. But I think that dynamic we're going to see accelerate. We're going to see it happening at the state level in many states. We're going to see more interest in that at the federal level. And part of the reason for that is that there are a lot of companies that are very engaged and interested and are communicating that to elected officials at the state and federal level. And because of their interest, there is a greater sense that this kind of collaborative effort could enable us to accelerate the progress we're making around solving broadband problems. Hence, grants that will be awarded for public-private partnerships and grant applications or grant programs that may not be explicitly for public-private partnerships, but the grant application will be that much more competitive because of the partnership element of it, very much favored by grant makers, policymakers, and so on. So what does this mean for the kinds of companies that I see in this space? Well, competitor ISPs that are seeking new opportunity to build in places where they are not the incumbent have already been engaged in this sort of thing for well over a decade. And there are more and more of them doing this all the time. But the remarkable development, I would say, of the last 2 to 3 years is that we see incumbent ISPs, meaning the traditional phone and cable ISPs, also seeking these kinds of opportunities. Now, I'll talk about this in a few minutes. Many of these companies are also seeking things that I would not call a partnership. So if what they are saying to your community is, give us your rescue plan dollars, your fiscal recovery dollars, and we'll build what we see fit and own it. I wouldn't call that a partnership. I would call that mostly you giving them a grant to build something that they might or might not have built anyway. And that, I don't mean to dismiss. Many communities will choose to do that. I think, though, that all of these companies are demonstrating around the country that where they have the opportunity, or the only opportunity, is to build a collaborative partnership that is win-win, and where the community gets something out of the collaboration and the partnership also. Both competitive and incumbent ISPs are signaling willingness. And I'll give you a couple of examples on the incumbent side. Charter Communications in a number of states is responding to RFPs, seeking partners who will make enforceable commitments to build and operate communications networks in the long term that meet certain kinds of performance requirements, pricing requirements, and so on, in return for funding from the local government. That's not just a give us your funds and we'll build what we want. It's a, in return for access to your funds, we will build what you want, and we will negotiate and make commitments around what we as an incumbent deliver. I don't know that we would have seen that even just a few years ago, but we are seeing most of the major incumbents look at and aggressively seek opportunities like that in the current moment. Another example would be there is one incumbent phone company, Consolidated Communications, that has entered into a wide series of different kinds of partnerships, negotiated, each of them custom negotiated with different communities in New England, in which it is making commitments to, in return for public funds, build infrastructure to the specifications of the community that in some cases the community will continue to own, and the company will operate and pay the community for access to that infrastructure, effectively removing a large amount of the risk from the community and enabling it to use its funds, whether fiscal recovery funds, grant funds, or bond proceeds, in order to meet its broadband needs. These are remarkable developments, and what they tell me is that in the current moment, we are seeing companies signal flexibility and interest in working with local communities in a way that was really not the case in previous years. A couple of examples. So just a few more quick items I want to highlight. I think you've probably all heard about this, but electric utilities, particularly the cooperatives, are very deeply engaged in the broadband space. These are private entities that are potentially superb partners to your communities. And then, that third and fourth category here on my slide, I'll share just that investors who have traditionally invested in other infrastructure classes are increasingly and quite aggressively looking for broadband opportunities. And this is across lots of different kinds of investor categories. I won't go into too much detail other than to say that we are seeing enormous interest by private investors, many of them requiring pretty high returns, but enormous interest in broadband. And they are putting their capital into areas where they will see that very high return. But in my experience, most of them are very flexible and willing to work with public entities who can help them to make the business case work in areas that wouldn't otherwise see returns that were adequate for them, such as rural areas, in some cases such as low-income neighborhoods or low-income communities. And what this means is that I think as you think about what your options are, your range of partners is far broader than just the phone or cable company in your community. And I'd recommend thinking about how to engage a broader range of entities, not least because competitive process will get you better outcomes and frankly, just a better deal. All right, let's talk about the kinds of business models that are out there. And I'm about to launch in, I think, on the heart of my presentation. So before I do that, I am going to ask Bill to give me a time check and let me know how I'm doing.
You're doing great.
Okay, not going on too long. Excellent. Stop.
You're our main speaker today, so we have till 1 o'clock. So
Okay, I'm going to take every minute of that if I can, making sure that we have lots and lots of time, hopefully, for questions and answers. So launching into partnership business models, and if you'll recall what I said, I think this is really the heart of where you can see how there is an alignment of how a community and a private entity might work together, and a grant or funding strategy that comes from that, and where I think grant opportunities are going to be greater, and value for your existing funding, your existing money will be greater also because of the potential to work with one or more partners. As we talk about business models, let's talk about the scope and the scale of what we're looking at. And generally, I think there are three scope considerations that, as you define your project and your strategy, these are going to be the three big ones that you would think about with variations on them. The first is your effort to develop a partnership going to be based on something that is community-wide? And in some rural communities, this may be the case. In some urban and suburban communities, it may also be the case where the goal of the community is maximizing competition. And even if there is some broadband, in some places, even if there's adequate broadband, in some places, getting to better than adequacy, getting to best in class, and getting to world-class and community-wide. More common, I think, are going to be the second two categories, which are models in which the partnership is designed to address the need to fill certain gaps. And the traditional gap that we always look at, obviously, is the rural broadband gap, where we know there are substantial parts of the United States, mostly rural, that are very low density, where there is no existing broadband at all. Depending on how you define broadband, this is a pretty considerable number of people and area of the country. And many of the projects that will materialize in Illinois and other states will be designed to fill the geographic gaps that exist in rural areas, where a rural community will be able to look at its existing infrastructure, identify the areas which that don't have any broadband whatsoever because they are low density and there was not a private sector business case to build there. And in order to change that private sector business case and make it more attractive, the community will seek to build a partnership in that area where there is that geographic gap in broadband. The third category, I think, is really important also, and it is not limited to rural areas. But there are, quite frankly, going to be many of our communities where the distribution of broadband infrastructure is not even, or to use a different term, not equitable. And that is frequently going to be based on demographics. And not because I think the companies are opposed as a matter of principle to serving certain demographic groups, but because the companies build where the return is greatest, where the return on investment is greatest, where their money will make the most money. And frequently, what that means is that the areas that are higher income, where there's more disposable income, where the revenues are going to be greater, will be the areas where there is the most investment. And the areas that are lower income are going to be the ones where the return will be lower because there's simply less money in the community to spend on broadband services, including internet data services, phone service, and video or cable television. And so those areas are just of less interest. For a community, even understanding why the private sector does what it does, that could be a very troubling outcome. For a community looking at that and saying, some areas based on demographics are going to see better broadband, world-class broadband, more competition, and others are not. That's a policy concern and a pretty dramatic one in many communities. And for those communities, the goal is going to be, how do we develop a partnership that enables us to fill these gaps that are based on demographics and ensure that we have an equal distribution of this infrastructure across our community for equity reasons, but also for economic reasons, for all of the reasons that make broadband important to all of us on a day-to-day basis, and that are the reasons that all of you who represent communities are here on this call today. Those policy goals, if delivered only to certain parts of our communities and not to others, that is a gaping challenge. It also potentially means that we will see a widening of the digital divide over time rather than a lessening of that divide. And that's a huge policy concern for many communities. So the scope may be based on that consideration. Let me add one more thought in this regard. Partnerships are not limited only to places where there is no broadband at all. For a community where there is some level of broadband everywhere, such as, for example, let's say a cable company that can deliver 100 megabits in the downstream direction, but what is happening is that the phone company has upgraded its very old copper infrastructure to fiber only in select neighborhoods. And those select neighborhoods, those families can now get gigabit services over that fiber for $75 a month. But in the other neighborhoods, the old phone company infrastructure will only deliver a megabit, that is 1/1000th of a gigabit, for a price that's not much lower than that 75. It might be 55 or 60. The community might look at that and say, this is where we need a partnership. There might be other forms of broadband here, but what we are seeing is that the competitor building the best broadband, the fiber to the premises, is only going to select areas, and we have to try to change that dynamic through a partnership and through using the resources that we have, so that we know that that competition, that fiber, that best-in-class infrastructure, those gigabit services go everywhere, not least because where the fiber is, the wireless will follow. 5G requires an awful lot of fiber. 6G will require even more when it materializes in the future, as will future generations of wireless. If really dense fiber only goes to the wealthy neighborhoods, that's where the wireless is going to go first as well. And again, to my point about exacerbation of the digital divide, can we use partnerships? Can we use this one-time funding that many of our communities around the country have through the fiscal recovery funds, and the influence they have with their state grant makers, and the potential to access federal funds by supporting private partners and building collaborations with private partners? Can we use all of that to try to make sure that this exacerbation of the digital divide based on select upgrades, select deployment by new competitors, cherry picking of neighborhoods based on demographics? We can't change that. That's how the private sector operates and is entitled to operate under our system and under our economy. But can we shape it and influence it so that we get to something that is more equally distributed in this current moment that is so promising, not just for broadband? To Matt's point, this is our broadband moment, but this is also our broadband partnership moment to try to improve that particular set of outcomes. Okay, that's enough on scope, but hopefully that gives you a sense of the kinds of frameworks we're seeing around the country. So now the actual business models. Keeping this at a relatively high level, these really divide up into two big buckets. One is private ownership of the infrastructure, and the other one is public ownership of the infrastructure. And then there's a lot of detail around both of those. But the key insight here around the partnership is the community going to provide funds to a private or other partner for that partner to own something and make promises around it? Or is the community going to use its funds to build something that it will itself own and provide to the private partner for use? That is one of the key decisions and considerations. I had a call earlier today with a set of communities in another state where there is a legal prohibition on local governments owning and leasing fiber to the private sector. They are limited under this model to just that first category on the slide. I am happy to say, I don't think you face anything like that in the state of Illinois. You have an enormous amount of flexibility, thanks to the support and thoughtfulness of your elected leadership. And you have this full range of options ahead of you. Let's start with the private ownership model, and I'll talk about that a bit and give you a few examples, and then I'll come back to the public ownership. As I said before, when I say partnership, I don't mean a partner as it is understood in corporations law or partnership law. I mean something much broader than that, but I do mean something that will have contractual obligations of on both sides of this collaboration between the public and the private entity. And here, where we're talking about private ownership, the community may be providing a lot of the resources, either through a grant or support with a grant application to federal or state grant makers. But the company, the private partner, is making real and enforceable commitments to deliver something in return for that. It's not a blank check. It's not a, we're giving the company the money and they're going to build where they see fit rather than meeting our needs. And it's not, we're giving the company the money and they're going to deliver whatever services and pricing and service levels they see fit rather than meeting the needs of the community. There are communities that are doing those things. They are just handing over the rescue plan dollars to private companies without any requirements on what the private companies do, other than that they spend them in that community. But my own take on that is that that is an unconditioned grant. It's not a real partnership. When I talk about a private ownership partnership model here, it may be that your private partner will own and control the infrastructure that is built. But the partnership piece of this is that they will make enforceable commitments to your community. And those enforceable commitments will help you to secure the policy goals that we have been talking about, that I was talking about on the last slide, around equal distribution and equity and opportunity, as well as all the other policy goals that underlie your interest in broadband to begin with. So in this model, you would, through a range of different mechanisms, although we would recommend one that is competitive in order to get you the best deal possible, make a grant to one or more entities who commit to building and operating and maintaining over a period of time communications infrastructure in the areas that are most important to you. And they may do it wholly or in part with your funds, but they will make commitments around that infrastructure pretty broadly. By the way, they may also make commitments that are broader than just the infrastructure that is funded with your dollars. So, for example, you'll recall in the last slide, I went on for quite a while about what a community might want to do in filling gaps that are based on demographics, where a private entity is building, but only in select areas, or the private entity might build in select areas because they have a business case there. In this collaboration model, one thing that might happen is through a competitive process by offering grant funds you are able to attract an entity to your community who will build some portions of the community with their own dollars and other portions with your dollars, and make commitments for all of that in return for your grant dollars. So the commitments don't have to be limited only to the areas that your money is actually funding for construction. The commitments can be broader. And in that way, you can shape and attract private investment that will in some ways match your own public investment, in the way that I was talking about earlier around why the partnership model is of real benefit to a community. Another way of putting this is that your fiscal recovery dollars or your support for getting grants, that whole bundle of you effectively delivering resources to a private company for a network it will own, but resources that it would not otherwise have, you can use those in the same way you would other kinds of economic development incentives, or you would in other economic development sectors, to attract private capital, to attract private investment in your community that wouldn't otherwise be there. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment on private ownership and move on to public ownership and what the partnership models look like here. By the way, as an aside, and I'll talk about this more in a couple minutes, if you think about what I just described and think about what that might look like in the form of a grant application, and I can't speak to the Illinois grant application process or its terms, but I can to some other states, as well as to some federal programs. I think that what I just described makes for a more attractive and compelling and competitive grant application in many cases, because that leveraging of public dollars with private and the broader impact than just what the public dollars will deliver, as well as, quite frankly, the private ownership, which gives some grant makers a certain amount of confidence. That outcome is something that I think is very fundable and very attractive to certain kinds of grant makers and policymakers at the moment. And the structure potentially is compelling from that standpoint for receiving grants. Okay, back to the public ownership element. So on the public ownership side, at its core, the idea here is that you will have a private partner or more than one private partner who will do a lot of the execution of building, designing, maintaining, and operating the communications network in your community. But at its core, the underlying infrastructure will still belong to you as a community. And this, for some companies, is uncomfortable and not the direction they want to go. But for other companies, is the kind of partnership they are very much willing to engage, including, as I described a little while ago, Consolidated Communications in New England is entering into partnerships of this sort. Now, there are a couple of different elements to what makes this kind of structure viable for those companies. The first one is they need a long-term right of use for that infrastructure, because if they come in as your partner, put in the effort, put the resources, the human resources, and rather than into another community, into this community, even if they're building partially or primarily with your dollars, they are investing quite a bit in your community, and they need business certainty in the long run and the opportunity to really leverage this infrastructure, commercialize it, and make money on it in order to be interested. So what we see is that even though there will be public ownership, the private partner will almost always have a very long-term right to use that public asset. And I have been involved in deals of this sort for a while, and I've never done one for less than 20 years. In some cases, it'll be 20 years with a couple of 10-year extensions So potentially getting to 30 or 40 or 50 years. We've had a couple of partners ask for 99-year deals, and I've never seen one of those materialize yet in this space, and I'm not sure I would recommend it, but certainly thinking about 20 as the kind of base case is a good place to be. So the idea is public provides a lot of the resources to build the thing. Private entity builds it, operates it, commercializes it, makes use of it for some guaranteed long term. Of course, if they default on their obligations, they could lose access to the asset, but assuming that they're meeting all the requirements of the partnership, they would have long-term use of that asset. And that is what attracts many private companies to this model. And in addition to it, the other thing that attracts them is the access to that public capital. It allows them to scale, to build their companies faster, to build to more customers without having to come up with the initial capital themselves, and to build to places where they wouldn't be able to do it with their own dollars. They need a public partner to take some of that cost for them because they simply don't have sufficient return. Now, two variations on this public ownership model from the standpoint of who does what. And I'm not even sure this is all that important in terms of the core things you need to know. This is more tactical than strategic, but in some cases, the public owner, let's say it's a county that has certain kinds of funds and wants to enter into this kind of process, that county will design and build a network, let's say a fiber to the home network, using contract labor or building some kind of mechanism internally to do it itself, and then will lease to another entity the underlying communications asset for that long term and enter into that partnership just for use of the asset and service provision. A variation on that, and again, this is tactical, not strategic, but you should know that there's a lot of this happening right now. In fact, I think this is one of the most common models I'm seeing in the current moment, is that the partnership will be for everything. It'll be turnkey execution so that the public entity, in my hypothetical, the county, doesn't have to actually design, build, maintain, or operate. It all gets done by a private partner. It's a single big procurement through a competitive process, and the public partner agrees it will design and build a network to particular technical parameters and performance specifications using a certain number of public funds, and that might be what they're bidding, how many public dollars they want. And in addition, they will then operate and provide service over that network and pay the public owner of the network for access to that network. And how much that payment will be is going to vary from project to project. It will also, I think, have everything to do with the economics of this deal and what makes it compelling to that private entity and what is the requirement of all of you as communities.
Joanne?
Yes.
A couple questions. One is about what kind of things go into these termination clauses?
That's an excellent question. And let me answer it this way. Here are some of the kinds of things that we would recommend you build into your competitive procurement, your talks and planning with potential private partners, your contracts with the private partners that are their obligations to meet, and that in the event they do not meet these obligations, that failure to meet these obligations would have consequences, including potentially termination of the relationship.
Have you seen, do you have good models that you would cite as a community that would be has reasonable but strong kind of clauses?
Yeah, I would be delighted to provide some examples if that's useful. Bill, maybe I can send to you and to Matt some contracts that we have negotiated in the last few years that we think secure the policy goals of the communities, and every community needs to determine its own policy goals, but contracts that secure those policy goals while not overly burdening the private partner, because of course you want the private partner to look at this and say this is very attractive, right? Anything that creates huge additional costs for them is going to be a problem, or make the business case that much more challenging for them. So we want to always negotiate for the things that are really important to your community, ignore the things that are not important so that you're not paying a cost for that, and try to build a partnership that again is win-win. The community gets its policy goals met, the partner gets a new business opportunity that it would not otherwise have. And walking that line is something that every community has to define for itself, but I will provide some examples.
That's great, thank you. And we'll post those on the webinar page. Something that goes along with that is a question about, you know, cost to, let's say we're talking about the rural Illinois countryside, and we may be at $8,000 to $10,000 a passing out in farm country for a fiber network. What's a, you know, from your perspective, how much investment can a private sector company take on per passing, where it's kind of in the ballpark of, and I know that depends on if it's a for-profit or publicly traded or privately traded or cooperative, but how much debt or how much investment can a single passing kind of support?
So that is a really good question. I will say that the companies that we are negotiating with now on behalf of public utilities and public entities are generally finding they have a business case at somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 per passing, depending on the company. Some of them will go a little bit higher in markets that are really attractive. But anything above $2,000, $2,500 becomes quite uninteresting to them. Now I'm thinking about competitive providers here who are coming into a new market and building new infrastructure. It's important to note, by the way, that for incumbents, upgrading existing infrastructure can be much more cost effective. And their metrics will sometimes be very different because they can upgrade for much lower cost, and so they're expecting higher returns. But if you're looking at a market in which you know it's going to cost $8,000 per passing, you know, unfortunately, I think you're probably looking at less than 25% of that is likely to be attractive in terms of their own investment for that private entity, but it's going to differ from one company to another. If they happen to have the surrounding areas, that might be a very attractive proposition for them, or it's more attractive because they are going to be able to expand into that area. If they're coming in anew, the economics are somewhat different. But as you all think about how do you change the math to make something attractive for a private investor, you might want to think about that 1,000 to 2,000 per passing number as at least a ballpark for understanding what is interesting to them economically. And if the actual requirements of building are higher than that, then as between you as a local community and your partners at the state and your partners among the federal funders, you want to try to make up that gap. And then you want to offer that to your private partners in return for them making commitments that they will place as much emphasis on the things that you care about as you have placed on the things they care about, which is making a return on their investment. And those are these kinds of things, that they will serve everyone regardless of their income level, that they will benchmark pricing. So for example, that if they are building in rural Illinois, that they will offer the same kinds of services and pricing in rural Illinois that they might offer in the suburbs of St. Louis or Chicago or in Champaign and Urbana. That would be the benchmarking piece, that they'll invest in the network over time, that they will provide high quality customer service. Those kinds of things could be the elements of your partnership, as well as their willingness to work with you on other kinds of policy goals to help you promote their network as you do economic development work, trying to attract businesses to town, help you to provide services to lower income members of the community at lower cost, all of those kinds of policy goals that you might have.
Okay, good. One final question is, you talked about Consolidated, and they're kind of a mid-sized provider. And then Charter is kind of, also in that. Any movement by the Baby Bells to do these public-private partnerships?
So
particularly one that's dominant in Illinois.
Yeah, I'm afraid I cannot speak to AT&T. I have not seen that yet. I'm going to choose to be optimistic that AT&T will see a path forward in this regard, not just to accept public funding, which AT&T does a lot of. I mean, it is a company that is heavily subsidized at the state and federal level through all kinds of universal service mechanisms like the Connect America Fund, and before that, the High Cost Fund and E-rate and so on. But I think just as importantly to be open to meeting the needs of communities and having the conversation with communities about the kinds of things communities care about, like, let's make sure this goes to everyone and not just to some folks, and that pricing feels equitable and fair for everybody relative to the services. But if I haven't seen it yet with AT&T, it doesn't mean that it's not coming or not even already happening. I think we are in such a dynamic moment, and there is so much creativity at the local level and willingness of other companies to partner that I just see the incumbents getting engaged. And quite frankly, those cases where I have seen Charter really engage has been in part because Charter is in adjoining markets and does not want to see communities open the door and create opportunity for competitors to edge in right next to them. So they're protecting their ability to move into those unserved markets or to continue to dominate existing markets by competing for these public-private partnerships, just because they're concerned about the potential competition from other entities who might compete for those public-private partnerships. So there are some external factors that are leading to the participation of incumbent providers in some of these initiatives. It's not just that they've decided they want to, but in some cases they feel they have to. And for all of you in communities, it's really your job to create an environment in which your potential partners want to and have to work with you, and that everybody comes out with what they need from the partnership. But that have to piece is not a small piece of it, and that's part of the reason why we recommend competitive process.
I'm going to interrupt one more time. Kind of in Rockford, Illinois, they've announced that Sci-Fi is possibly going to build there. And it's kind of, okay, we're do a big press release, and then kind of something happens over a period of time. Is that kind of goes against kind of your competitive process idea, that it's a, where let's cut a deal, let's put proposals on the table, let's negotiate, as opposed to kind of going down the road with one company. Any feedback on that?
Yeah, the Rockford example and the Sci-Fi example is a really interesting one because, quite frankly, what Sci-Fi is currently doing doesn't really fit into my hypothesis here of what a partnership is. Not that there's not a potential partnership between Rockford and Sci-Fi. There is a collaboration there, but it's not exactly what I think is contemplated here. Sci-Fi is a company that seeks private financing when it builds a network. To its credit, And to its credit, it also generally commits to building on a universal basis. It builds everywhere. Sci-Fi, by the way, checks the box on a lot of these policy goals, and it does it with private capital rather than public capital. So that's a real plus. I think very highly of the way they do that. But what they're looking for from a community is not funding. There was a time 10 years back when they were doing that, and then they changed their model so that they're largely funded now by private equity rather than by communities. What they look for from communities is a different form of partnership that, for today's purpose, let's just call collaboration, where the community facilitates their build, where the community makes commitments that it will really move heaven and earth to make sure that nothing gets in the way of deployment, that the permitting process will be smooth, that the city engineer has reviewed their designs and is comfortable with the rather innovative and boundary pushing construction processes that they're using. They're looking more for facilitation than financial partnership from communities. And so that may or may not be something you can secure through a competitive process. But the other thing I'll share related to that, the Sci-Fi Rockford scenario, without knowing exactly what happened there, is just that I wouldn't recommend releasing a press release or deciding that you're able to feel like your job is done until the job is really done. In the Sci-Fi example, they investigate communities, they build these collaborations with the communities, they do all of their work to plan, and then they go out and they talk to private equity investors. And if they don't find a private equity investor, or if something else goes wrong, they will not then build. So when they say to the community, yes, we are interested, we'd like to build here, unless they've already got the financing nailed down and all the other elements of the project, I think it's not yet time for a press release. It might be time to say, we're working on this collaboration, we're working with Sci-Fi as our partner, but I always worry that the expectations get out ahead of reality, and that might be an example of where that happened. Does that answer your question, Bill?
It does. That's very informative. Thanks.
Hi, this is Dino Purdue with AT&T. If I may comment on the previous question of AT&T's engagement and interest in these programs or projects. We are very interested. We are actually responding to grant applications in other states already, and in that process. So we are interested, very interested in a competitive process in Illinois where we can have an opportunity to bid on projects that are engaging with local government partnerships and so forth. So nothing that you described today is outside of our consideration when we're looking at these kind of projects. So as it develops in Illinois, I think we're somewhat behind some other states in terms of the allocation of funds and the process of bidding these projects, but we're very interested in that. The one concern that we may have here too, and it would be helpful if we had some guidance, is on the procurement process itself. Are we looking at a state process of procurement? Are we looking at the local government process? There's some restrictions that seem to be, in conflict with the partnership and a discussion of some of these projects. So it would be nice to have some guidance in that direction for the private sector.
Well, I will just say, as an outsider to Illinois, I am really delighted to hear that. And but for all of the other states in which I work also, I'm delighted to hear that and very glad that AT&T is interested, because that seems like it would be a win-win on many of the projects that are contemplated in local communities. As far as state of Illinois procurement, I can't speak to that, or the state program. I would have to defer to my colleagues from the state, but I'll share only that in terms of the guidance I was offering communities, my recommendation is, of course, you would want a procurement process that is competitive if it's required by state and local law, but just as a business matter, I can't speak from a legal standpoint, but as a business matter, we recommend a competitive process because we think communities end up with stronger partnerships that better serve their needs and their requirements if they go through a really rigorous and robust process of planning, designing what they would optimally like the partnership to look like, soliciting input and feedback from the private sector to determine what that should look like, including what the grant applications to the state and federal government might be. Then selecting a partner through a competitive process that allows them to get commitments from the partner. So that's a business process matter.
Yeah, I think the procurement process in Illinois is so complex and confusing that we probably need another session just to talk about that. But some guidance from the state or some of the locals and just in how we should proceed would be very helpful.
Would it be helpful if I described a handful of scenarios for initiatives that I've seen elsewhere?
I think it sounds like this might be a job for Matt and the Office of Broadband, and maybe have a provider-specific kind of discussion about some of the issues and have a good conversation there. But thanks for joining today. We appreciate AT&T being on the call.
Joanne, you've got about 10 more minutes, so I want to make sure that you finish your presentation before we open it up for questions or further questions.
Well, I would love to get further questions now, and rather than using up the remaining 10 minutes speaking, I think what I wanted to talk about last was really how this looks in terms of the grant environment. And we don't know what the infrastructure bill is likely. Well, we don't know whether it's going to happen or not, or whether it'll happen in a different form. But as you all know, the bipartisan infrastructure bill that is currently knocking around in Washington, for lack of a better term, I don't know how to characterize it. Well, it looks like it's on life support today, but yesterday it looked pretty good. So tomorrow it might look good again. But that bipartisan infrastructure bill will distribute considerable funds to the states, as did the American Rescue Plan Act. And so I am optimistic that state grant programs will not only allow, but actually encourage public-private partnerships, because as I think you've all probably gathered from what I've said so far, I think these partnerships are multipliers in important ways for making the economic case much more attractive for private investors to go to places where they wouldn't otherwise, and for communities to achieve things that they could not do otherwise, that they could not do with only their own dollars, and that they really couldn't do in terms of shaping private investment. So I will just say that my sense of it is that we are at a moment where grant programs, even if they don't explicitly require partnerships, will be positively inclined toward them, with one exception, which is the Reconnect program, which is a pre-existing program. This is USDA's pre-existing rural broadband grant program that was created in, I think, 2017. And I will just share that that particular program does not contemplate one entity owning the infrastructure and another one operating it. That's an uncomfortable scenario for USDA. They need one entity to be responsible for everything, but they absolutely welcome applications from public or private entities who have the support and the active collaboration of the others. Other grant programs, the ones that have been created more recently, are very explicitly comfortable with the partnership model. And that includes the existing BIP program at NTIA that I know you're all aware of, that is funded through, that will close on August 17th, so short timeline, but also the programs administered by the Economic Development Administration, which were announced last week. They released their notice of funding opportunity, and the other NTIA programs that very much are comfortable with this split of responsibility, risk, and reward. And I'll stop there and very much look forward to more questions.
Joanne, can you talk a little bit about the difference in, balance sheets? Community has a balance sheet and a private sector company has a balance sheet, and the balance sheet on the private sector is a little easier to understand. It's got the bottom line as a consideration, and with other concerns probably much lower down the field. The community has a balance sheet that has jobs and economic development and growth and so on. How does a community think about that balance sheet through the future? So looking at future benefits of a better broadband. How do you work with communities on that issue?
Wow. Well, there's an hour and a half of discussion minimum, day and a half. I think Bill just put his finger on really what is the heart of the matter and the biggest issue, really, which is that for commercial enterprises, they measure success based on the bottom line on a set of financial statements, right? Their progress and success and their challenges will always be reflected on a financial statement. And if they're publicly traded, also stock value, right? Those are the things that they are focused on entirely. If you're a community, obviously, you have to balance the books and make things work financially, but your bottom line metrics are not going to be only financial. You have to have a way to quantify or understand and place value on the critical policy goals that are at the heart of why you get involved in broadband to begin with. And that is not necessarily bringing in revenues to you as a government. It has to do with all of what economists would call the positive externalities. That is improved healthcare, better educational outcomes, less environmental degradation on account of less commuting, all of the, and certainly economic vitality, all of the things that brought you all to today's call to begin with. How we quantify that and how we think about that out in the long term is really hard. How do you put numbers on those? In some ways, I think researchers have been trying to do this since the very early days of the internet, and there is not yet any accepted body of academic research that says this is the value of what it means to have comprehensive fiber to the home, for example, in a community competing with cable, or this is the value of what it means to expand in this amount or that amount. What we do know is that lots of other communities are doing this. We know it is a necessary, if not sufficient, part of securing our communities for the 21st century. There is no scenario in which broadband is not an essential piece of being a vital community in the 21st century. And the better the broadband, the more vital. So we know that it is necessary. We don't know that we can in any way say broadband alone will be transformative, but we know it'll be a necessary piece of that. And as Matt said, this is the moment. This is when there's funding available. This is when there is opportunity. This is when you potentially have partners at the state and federal level in terms of funding this, as well as private partners who also recognize that this is the moment in which it's going to be easiest to reach places that are otherwise non-economical and to make more enticing or much more attractive places that are only marginally economical right now. In some ways, even if you don't know exactly what the value will be over time, I would suggest that the risk of missing this moment is really enormous. And I wouldn't have said that even a year ago, maybe even not 9 months ago, but I don't think we're going to see again in our lifetimes the kind of opportunity that we're seeing in the current moment. And in some ways, if it was the pandemic that created this opportunity, by bringing attention to broadband and bringing new public funding to broadband, I hope we never see this opportunity again in our lifetimes, because I wouldn't want us to have to go through that again. But now is certainly the moment to act, and you are fortunate to have great partners in the state of Illinois.
Good. Thank you, Joanne. That was really great. I really appreciate it, and I agree. These topics are big, and community vision drives a lot of these projects. That the mayor, the economic development committee, or someone or some group really takes the lead and makes these happen. They don't happen by accident or through hoping. It's a lot of work and driven by community leaders. So thank you so much for the presentation. It was really, really great. I want to invite people to join us next week on the 3rd for our final kind of infrastructure webinar around project development and project implementation. And I think we're going to have to redesign a little bit because Joanne did such a great job today. I think we can take our next one even a little further than we had hoped. And then on August 17th, a session on digital equity and digital inclusion that, of course, is a key foundation for public engagement in infrastructure development. So those will both be good sessions. So I encourage you to, if you're not registered already, to go back online and get registered at Extension and so on. We'll put up the video for this. You'll get an email from Nancy, and we'll have the slides, and we'll have some of that support material that Joanne promised us. So thank you so much for that. That'll be really interesting to hear, to see what folks are putting in these agreements, because it's one thing to enter into a partnership. You want to make sure you can get out of it if it's not working for the parties, and so that's very important. So thanks again, Joanne. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Extension, Benton Institute, and the Office of Broadband.